So we've made it to our very last topic in Biology 228. And what we're going to look at with this video is a series of events that are happening with the female reproductive system. So we're going to look at the ovarian cycle and talk about how eggs, or what are also known as oocytes, actually develop within the female ovaries. If you look at this picture that I've got here, this is an artist's representation of the ovaries. And you'll notice that we've got these little pictures within the ovary that are represented by a number. What these are showing us are eggs in different stages of development within the ovaries. So I want to give you kind of a brief overview to what's happening in the ovarian cycle with this particular slide, and then we'll get more into the details of the different steps with our ensuing slides. If you look at this first picture over here that's labeled number 1, this is the first step in what's known as the follicular phase. So right in the center of this object you're seeing here, we've got this dark red circle, and that is an oocyte or an egg. It's an immature egg that's getting ready to start this process of development. You'll notice that the egg has some cells that are surrounding it that are in kind of a lighter red color. These are what are known as follicular cells. And when you have an oocyte that's surrounded by these cells, it's referred to as a follicle. So the first stage, or the first phase of development in the ovarian cycle, is what's known as the follicular phase. And this is the time when the oocyte is within the ovaries, it's maturing within this follicle or within these follicular cells, it's becoming larger, and it's getting ready to be something that is mature and able to be released and fertilized by sperm. The last stage in the follicular phase is what's known as ovulation, and you can see that represented here. This is the time when the mature oocyte, or the mature egg, is actually released from the ovaries into the fallopian tubes, where it has the potential to be fertilized by sperm. Typically, if you have a normal 28-day cycle, the follicular phase, where we go from this step over here all the way to ovulation, takes 14 days. It is not uncommon for women to have cycles that are longer than 28 days or a little bit shorter than 28 days. And if that's the case, what that means is your follicular phase is either taking a little bit longer than 14 days if your cycles are longer, or it's taking a little bit less time than 14 days if your cycles are shorter, for that follicle to become mature and be ready to be released. Once we've released that oocyte, we've had this process of ovulation, we transfer into the second phase, or the second stage of the ovarian cycle, which is known as the luteal phase. So during the luteal phase, we get development of a structure that you can see represented here in yellow. It's known as the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum is active for about 10 days. And if pregnancy doesn't ensue, then it starts to degenerate. So the luteal phase altogether, from the time that the corpus luteum develops until it degenerates, is 14 days. And that's consistent across the board for everyone, no matter how long their cycles are. So if your cycle is a little bit longer or a little bit shorter than average, it's due to differences within the follicular phase. So we've had kind of a brief overview of the ovarian cycle and what it is that we're talking about, the maturation of follicles and oocytes within those follicles happening in the ovaries. What I want to do now is go into each of these different phases in a little bit more detail. So talk more about what's happening in the follicular phase in each of the stages, and also talk about what's happening more in the luteal phase as well. So I mentioned previously that over here in this picture labeled number 1, we have this immature oocyte that is just starting this process of development. And when it's just starting this process of development, or even before it started the process of development, it's what's known as a primordial follicle. You may have a chance in lab to look at primordial follicles under a microscope, and what you'll find is that they typically tend to be towards the very outer margins of the ovaries. So that's where you'll find them if you're looking at those slides in lab. A primordial follicle, by definition, is an oocyte. So I'm going to draw that because I know this picture is a little bit small and might be hard to see. It's an oocyte that is surrounded by a single layer of very flat cells. So I'm doing my best with the tools that I have to draw in these very flat cells surrounding an oocyte, which is what a primordial follicle is. The first step in a primordial follicle's development is it needs to become what's known as a primary follicle. So there's a couple of things that need to happen in order for this to occur. And you can see these things happening in this diagram as we move from this picture here that is notated as number 1 over to number 2. Basically, the oocyte has to enlarge, so it's going to increase in size. I'm going to draw this again for you because I know this diagram's kind of small. It might be hard to see. And the other thing that happens is those flattened squamous shaped cells that were surrounding the oocyte change and they become cuboidal cells. And when we've got that enlarged oocyte and we've got the cuboidal cells that are surrounding it, I won't draw them in all the way around. Now we're dealing with a primary follicle. A primary follicle next becomes a secondary follicle, and you can see this process of development happening in these pictures that are labeled 3, 4, and 5. So several different things need to happen as we're going from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. The first thing is those cells that surrounded the oocyte. So I mentioned previously that they're known as follicular cells. They change. So remember, with our primordial follicle and our primary follicle, we had a single layer of cells. And what happens is we start to lay down additional layers of cells. So I'm making something that kind of looks like a flower because I'm not a good artist, but it's supposed to look like a cell that's surrounded by cuboidal shaped cells. And what happens next is we start laying down additional layers of these cells surrounding the oocyte. So that's kind of the first thing that happens. Once we have 2 layers or more of cells surrounding the oocyte, we stop calling them follicular cells and we start calling them granulosa cells. And that's really important because granulosa cells are actually one of 2 structures in the ovaries that produce estrogen. So once we start having these granulosa cells, what we see happening is that the ovaries are producing estrogen and estrogen levels are starting to increase in the female body. We'll continue to see more and more layers being put down around this oocyte. And the more layers we have, the more estrogen is going to be produced. So as we're moving from a primary follicle towards a secondary follicle and into these other stages, we're seeing more and more estrogen, and estrogen levels are increasing in the body. We get a few other things that are happening as we move from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. So if you look at this picture down here, you're starting to see kind of some black dots that are representing a membrane that surrounds this follicle. This membrane is what's known as the theca folliculi, and you can see it starting to condense around the follicle. And that's another thing that needs to happen as we're moving from a primary oocyte from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle. If you look inside at the oocyte itself, you'll notice that, at least over here, you can see it a little bit more clearly. There's kind of a dark red membrane that has also condensed around the oocyte or the egg itself. This is known as the zona pellucida. It's often just referred to as the zona. It is going to be there surrounding the oocyte, even following ovulation of that oocyte. So it's kind of a protective covering of the oocyte, and it's something that sperm, if it's going to fertilize that oocyte, has to be able to penetrate. So sperm in their head actually have a little capsule of enzymes that allows them to be able to penetrate through the zona so that they can fertilize the egg. But again, the structure forms as we're moving from a primary oocyte to a secondary, and it's there to kind of encapsulate that egg and help to protect it after it's released from the ovaries. The last thing that I want to mention happening, and this is really the key, when we get this structure formed, now we can say that we have a secondary follicle, is we get a structure forming which is known as the antrum. So you can see the beginnings of the antrum in this picture here, these little white areas. This is a cavity that's forming around the oocyte itself. It's going to be filled with fluid. And you can see, if we look at this next picture over here, that as it fills with fluid, it increases the size of the follicle and causes it to start to bulge against the wall. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're still talking about moving from a primary follicle to a secondary. And if you look at this picture here, here's the first place where we've got a secondary follicle, because you can see that antrum starting to form. As secondary follicles continue to develop, they become what's known as vesicular follicles. They're sometimes also referred to as Graafian follicles. So I'll spell that out for you. You may see this term used for them. And sometimes they're just referred to as mature follicles as well. So if you look at this picture that we have here in 6, this is a mature oocyte. It has completed the process of development to the point where it's mature, it's ready to be released from the ovaries. If you notice what's going on here, we've got an antrum that has expanded, so that's that fluid-filled cavity. It's expanded until it's separated the oocyte from the rest of the granulosa cells, and it's basically just attached on a little stalk that you see right here. So it's mostly been separated from the cells that used to surround it. The other thing you'll notice is it has swelled so much with this fluid that it's starting to bulge from the wall of the ovary. So that bulge is a sign that we've got a mature follicle with an oocyte that's ready to be released and will be released soon. The last step in the process, or in the follicular phase, is the ovulation that I talked about previously. So this is about a 5-minute process. Some women actually indicate that they can feel it. It is I guess at least on a small scale, violent event that happens in a female's body, because you do actually have to burst the wall of the ovary to release the oocyte, to release the egg from it. If you look at this picture down here, this is ovulation actually occurring in a female's body, and you can see it just looking at it under a microscope. So we've got this oocyte that's being released. You can see the fluid from the antrum that's being released with it here as well. And hopefully that egg is going to get sucked up into the fallopian tubes, where it has the potential to be fertilized by sperm. Ovulation is triggered by a surge in a hormone, which is known as luteinizing hormone. So I'll just say that now, and then we'll come back at the end of this and we'll talk about why luteinizing hormone causes ovulation to occur. But one of the things that I want you to notice before we go on to the next slide is it's really just the oocyte and the fluid from the antrum that gets released. And all of those cells, those granulosa cells that were producing estrogen, they stay behind in the ovary. So that's important for where we're going next. So once that ovulation has occurred, we've finished up the follicular phase, we've had a mature oocyte that has been ovulated, it's been released into the body. I mentioned that those granulosa cells stay following that. At this point, our follicle has been destroyed. So remember, it was the cells that made up the follicle that were producing estrogen previously. When we destroy that follicle through this somewhat violent process of ovulation, the follicle is no longer producing estrogen. So we actually see at this point, following ovulation, that estrogen levels in the body start to drop just a little bit. If you look at over here, what we've got going on in this picture labeled 8, we have a structure which is known as the corpus luteum that's starting to form. So the corpus luteum actually forms from those granulosa cells that were left behind. And it takes 3 or 4 days for it to form. But once it's there, once it's formed, it starts to produce estrogen. So we see estrogen levels starting to climb once again. And the other thing that it produces is progesterone. So that's the other female hormone that we haven't seen being produced up to this point. It's just when we're in that luteal phase and we've got the corpus luteum that's actually producing progesterone that we see progesterone levels starting to increase in the female body. So the corpus luteum sticks around for 10 days, about, give or take. And if no pregnancy ensues, it just starts to degenerate. And it becomes, over time, just a scar, which is known as the corpus albicans. When you have ovaries from a female that has gone through menses many times, basically she's going to have really scarred and really pitted ovaries from this process happening over and over again. So that's assuming that no pregnancy ensued. If that oocyte that was ovulated actually becomes fertilized, then what happens is the embryo, which is the fertilized oocyte, very quickly starts to produce a hormone which is known as human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. And HCG is going to maintain the corpus luteum so that it doesn't degenerate. And it's going to be there through pregnancy, producing estrogen and progesterone to help sustain that pregnancy. So we've talked about what's going on physically with structures in the ovary. So how follicles are actually developing, the different stages that they go through, what's happening with the corpus luteum. We've talked a little bit also about some of the things that are going on hormonally. So when estrogen's being produced, when progesterone's being produced. What I want to do here is kind of tie that all together. So previously we learned about the male HPGA, and I mentioned that I wanted to get you really familiar with it before we go into the female HPGA, because the female one is just a little bit more complicated. It has just one little tweak about it that's a little bit different. So here is a diagram that kind of walks you through the female HPGA. You'll notice that the same structures are involved, at least as far as the brain is concerned. So the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and they're releasing hormones that communicate, travel through the blood and communicate with eggs in the ovaries and cause their development. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. What I want to do is start out at day 1 in a female cycle. So day 1 is actually the day that menses starts. And the reason that we define that as day 1 is because it's obvious, right? You can know that it's day 1 if menses starts. Otherwise, we're talking about internal changes that you wouldn't really know where you are at in the cycle. But on day 1, the hypothalamus starts to produce the same hormone that we see in males, gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, and it travels through the blood just a small distance to the anterior pituitary. And just like what we see in the male HPGA, GnRH causes the anterior pituitary in females to produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So those same hormones that we saw in the male system. And those hormones get into the bloodstream. They travel, because we're talking about females, to the ovaries in this case, as opposed to the testes. And they trigger a primordial follicle to start to develop and go into that process where it's going from primordial follicle to primary follicle to secondary follicle to Graafian or mature vesicular follicle, whatever you want to call it. I mentioned that as a follicle is developing, that it starts to put multiple layers of cells around the oocyte, and that these cells are known as granulosa cells, and they produce estrogen. So as we have this follicle that's growing and it's increasing in size and it's getting more and more granulosa cells around it, what we're going to see happening is during this time, estrogen levels are increasing in the female. So estrogen is really kind of the female equivalent to testosterone. And as estrogen levels are increasing, just like we see in the male HPGA, that estrogen feeds back on these structures in the brain negatively, and it causes them to decrease the amount of hormones that they're releasing. So we'll see FSH starting to decrease, we'll see luteinizing hormones starting to decrease as estrogen levels rise. Now, we don't actually have the anterior pituitary stop making those hormones, and this is something I want to be clear about. It just stops releasing them. So these hormones start to build up in the anterior pituitary, and they're not released as we get this negative feedback from rising estrogen levels. Eventually, as we get more and more granulosa cells and more estrogen being produced, estrogen hits a critical mass or a peak level. And when it hits that critical mass, when we get enough estrogen, here's the one thing that's different about the female system, the little tweak. We no longer have negative feedback, and we switch to a positive feedback. So estrogen levels hit a certain level, that feeds back positively on the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary dumps all of the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone that it had been producing and not releasing. And you get this very, very large surge of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in the blood that happens very, very suddenly. That sudden spike in luteinizing hormone primarily causes our mature follicle to release the oocyte. So it actually triggers ovulation, as I mentioned before when I was talking about ovulation as a process. So you get that oocyte being released. You have those granulosa cells that stay behind. The granulosa cells become the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum takes over producing estrogen. So remember, there was this time period between here and here where we had destroyed the structure that was producing estrogen. So corpus luteum forms, it starts to produce estrogen once again. It produces progesterone as well. And those two hormones, plus a hormone which is known as inhibin, feed back on the hypothalamus and on the anterior pituitary, again, negatively. And that negative feedback on these two structures in the brain is going to continue until the corpus luteum degenerates, which will take about 10 days. So we're going to have this negative feedback for 10 days. Following that, the corpus luteum starts to degenerate. As it starts to degenerate, it stops producing estrogen and progesterone and inhibin. This negative feedback ends, and that tells the hypothalamus, hey, it's time to start producing gonadotropin-releasing hormone again, communicating with the anterior pituitary to secrete follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and we start this process all over again.